The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Welcome to the show, everybody. I'd like to remind any new listeners that this is a live call-in show. Feel free to call in and share your thoughts and ideas and questions and rebuttals on the topic of the evening or anything that my co-host Lang or I say. Good evening, Lang Baker. Good to see you.
Howdy, Wayne.
And so anyway, 343-9927 if you'd like to call in and participate in the show. And tonight's topic is the issue of drones and just what kind of things they're doing, where they come from, and stuff like that. Anyway, Lang, there's not too much history to drones. From what I could see from a Business Insider article, drones have been around for about 2 decades. They're saying here, but back in World War I, the United States and France were both looking at ways to create radio-controlled airplanes, which would have been the first consideration of drones, I suppose. And I know when I was a kid, back in the 60s and everything, there were radio-controlled airplanes as hobbyists used. They were about 2 foot wingspan and a little single-cylinder gas-powered engine that people would control with a radio. So that was the beginning of the technology. But they've come a long ways since then. I think we've been hearing about Amazon talking about delivering products and everything with drones in the future and whatnot. But what's going on with that anyway? How many things did you find that people are? Well, first, let me specify: drones are some type of unmanned, guided aircraft, right?
That's what a lot of people restrict the definition to, an unmanned aerial vehicle, a UAV. They refer to them as. And others say, well, it's not a drone unless it also has certain kind of technological capabilities besides just being unmanned and able to fly.
Yeah, like I was talking before the show, there were the German the V-1 rockets, which were basically fixed-wing aircraft with the rocket engine that would fly very slowly and at low altitudes, but they'd time it to where it would just run out of fuel and fall on Britain. But
where you shoot an arrow out of bow and arrow, you've got an unmanned flying vehicle, but it's not exactly what you think of as a drone.
No, but the arrow is flying based upon the momentum imparted to it by the one-time, flexibility of the arrow of the bow, whereas the V-1 has its own, propel.
I guess also birds are unmanned flying vehicles.
Well, they're not. They're a different being now. Come on. Anyway, before we get into the different kinds of drones and uses, one of the things that I think everybody knows has come up now, one of the topics is who owns the airspace above our homes. And I was reading there's a story here from Scientific American. It starts out talking about on the evening of July 26th in Bullitt County, Kentucky, William Meredith's daughter came in from the backyard and told her father that she'd just seen a drone fly over their neighborhood. And Mr. Meredith went out with his shotgun and he saw this drone cruising up the street and he blasted it out of the sky. And a while later, the owner of the drone came by with some friends. The police got involved and they arrested Mr. Meredith for shooting it down. And, of course, this brought up the question about, well, who controls the airspace over your property? And I found this to be interesting. This is the same article with the Scientific American here. But they state here that before airplanes and drones existed, people owned everything above and below their land. According to the law, their rights extended, quote, to the heavens and down to hell. which, I guess. But modern aviation, they say, changed this definition in a big way. In the early 20th century, Congress declared the air a public highway, which limited land rights so that people were not trespassing every time they flew. And I guess that makes sense, And they also said the public highway was generally considered to be 500 feet and above. And then they mention a U.S. Supreme Court case involving a chicken farmer, United States versus Cosby. During World War II, the Army took over a local municipal airport and began flying practice flights and flew over the farmer's chicken coop at about 83 feet and caused a bunch of his chickens to panic and fly directly into a wall and kill themselves. Guess he got a batch of stupid chickens, huh? But anyway, he sued, and he actually won that case and had to be paid damages for an illegal takings. So anyway, from what I've seen here, they're talking about making it something like at 100 feet is you only control the air above your property up to 100 feet or whatever, and then people can do pretty much whatever they want.
So did it cite whether that's state law and varies from state to state, or the 100 feet limit, or where's
actually
that come
that's
from?
one of the problems. There are different states, it says here, that have different levels. California lawmakers created a no-fly zone for drones up to 350 feet. Up to 350 feet, yeah. And Governor Jerry Brown vetoed that. Then there's another one here in Minnesota, a local community, St. Bonifacius in Minnesota, made the height 400 feet. And that's one of the problems they're talking about here. The FAA is arguing that they need to control and set the regulations. Otherwise, you'll have different regulations in each state, and businesses that fly international, commerce would run into trouble every time they cross the state border with their drones or whatever.
Yeah, well, I suppose, there's issues of ownership, and then there's issues of regulation apart from ownership. I mean, there are laws that prohibit, firing firearms on your own property in city limits in certain communities. So that doesn't mean that you
can't fire them
that
at
you
all.
Don't own, and it doesn't mean you don't own that. It just means that there are regulated uses of it. Rules against open burning of trash in the city limits, things like that. So there can be regulation without addressing the issue of ownership.
I think so, and of course, back in my libertarian right-wing zealotry days, I wouldn't have agreed with that. If it's my property, I can do what I want with it, But I agree, you have to have some kind of regulations. We're allowed to be on our highways and roads in our vehicles, our motorized vehicles, but we can't just drive any way we want to. We've got to obey the rules so that everybody can do it safely.
And I guess part of the FAA's jurisdiction has to do with the risk of drones interfering with the aircraft that are under FAA jurisdiction. So there are restrictions on drones in close to airports or above a certain altitude, things like that.
Well, they were the regulations too. They're worried about them crashing and falling on people and things like that. In fact, I've got a press release here from June 21st, 2016, fact sheet, small unmanned aircraft regulations from the FAA. And they're talking about, they call them small unmanned aircraft, UASs. It says that the operating requirements include the small UAS operator manipulating the controls of a drone should always avoid manned aircraft and never operate in a careless or reckless manner. Well, I never thought about that, but anyway, you must keep your drone within sight. Alternatively, if you use first-person view or similar technology, you must still have a visual observer. Always keep your craft within unaided sight. You can fly during daylight or in twilight, which they define as 30 minutes before sunrise and 30 minutes after sunset. You can't fly a small UAS over anyone who is not directly participating in the operation. You can't, not under a covered structure or not inside a covered stationary vehicle. So no operations from a moving vehicle are allowed unless you are flying over a sparsely populated area. So basically, that regulation there would kill flying over somebody else's property. because if somebody's outside in their backyard and you send a drone over it, that would be a violation. I guess it would be endangering them if they could fall down, crash or whatever. But anyway, it's causing a whole new reevaluation of air traffic and control. They're also going to require pilot certification, too, and require background checks. And you've got to be at least 16 years old to qualify for a remote pilot certificate. So, anyway. All right, so now we've talked about problems that have been faced and are being dealt with, hopefully, as far as regulating the airways, the origins of drones. Let's talk about some of the uses.
Yeah, one of the articles I read was pointing out this new category of drones, commercial drones. And for quite a while, there have been military drones. We've heard about that in the news. And then there's the hobbyist drones that came out of the radio-controlled aircraft hobby group that later, with the introduction of miniaturization of components in the smartphone, a lot of those were adopted by hobbyists and incorporated into their radio-controlled vehicles. And so that's the hobbyist level of drone activity. And then newly emerging is the commercial use of drones that's kind of between these two in terms of the capabilities in the size and the prices. And that's where a lot of the exciting new uses are coming out. In the commercial drones have been developed out of what was the hobbyist rather than from the military. And there's a wide variety of uses and research into additional uses from agricultural uses where drones can fly over fields and gather various information through their cameras. A lot of the commercial uses are using the drones as a flying camera, basically, to gather data through photography. And over the fields, they can detect, by analyzing the photographs gathered, low moisture areas where your plants are stressed from not getting enough moisture, and from pest infestations of various kinds. And they can fly frequently enough and cheaply enough that they can gather this data and combine from multiple flyovers and create an animation where you can see the changes in the conditions in the fields. And this allows them to more efficiently use their irrigation resources and their pesticide application resources and things like this to manage their crops.
And fertilizer.
In fertilizer
usage, yeah.
Yeah, and so they reduce the cost of producing their crops.
Yes, and they reduce the amount of fertilizer being released into the environment, too.
Right, and so you're going to reduce the impact on the dead zone in the Gulf that we were talking about last week.
Yes.
You can reduce your fertilizer inputs.
Incidentally, I got a response on our Facebook page, on the Pause for Thought Facebook page, regarding that show. A woman that is retired from the EPA contacted me, and she said that the farmers, remember we were talking about the Iowa, the farmers in Iowa and the agriculture in Iowa polluting every single body of water in that state with animal feces and fertilizer. And she was saying that there are tile drainage systems that have been buried in the ground underneath much of the farmland in Iowa that facilitates the runoff of the water to keep the ground from getting too wet and muddy. And so that just speeds up the loss, the runoff of the fertilizer.
Accelerates, yeah.
Yeah, so that's certainly something that can be looked at. But I'm getting off the topic here, but I wanted to share that anyway. But,
And so that's an agricultural use, and the flying camera use of drones also is being used for industrial monitoring.
Yeah, before we go off for the agricultural use, though, you're saying that they can take enough photos at different periods of time and enough frequency to compile all that data, and I guess that would allow them to spot trends or see cycles to
Right.
where they could start being proactive in getting down pesticides or fertilizer, stuff
Right.
like that. So it really would improve things, yeah. Okay, and you were going on to the next.
Yeah, another application is for monitoring industrial processes, pipelines and wind turbines and refineries, offshore platforms, so that can be done more frequently and at less cost.
There's a manufacturing plant where I'm working right now that needed to inspect some sensors in their flare stacks. And, of course, previously they had to get a crane, a man lift, and raise people up there, to look at these things and all that. But they then went ahead and brought in drones that enable them to see everything without any risk to human beings. And so there's a way there.
Right.
And, with power lines,
right,
they used to inspect those with a trolley, I guess you'd call it, or a gondola that rode on the power cables. And they would just travel cross-country on these power lines, which would give me the heebie-jeebies.
Wow.
And then I guess I started inspecting them with helicopters, but now they can use drones. Just fly a drone down there.
Yeah, drones are a lot cheaper, and also with just as with agriculture, they can feed these observations over a period of time with the monitoring of pipelines and power lines and things like that. They can take that imagery, feed it into an AI, artificial intelligence analysis network that can detect defects or changes, anomalies, much more accurately than the human eye observing these conditions. So there's a greater potential there for catching problems before they get out of hand.
Yeah, I wonder now, since they can check the moisture of the dirt and everything on a farm, field, they might be able to detect leakage from a pipeline that's below ground and it hasn't revealed itself yet by coming to the surface. So that's another possibility there, yeah. Another one I have here is thermal sensor drones for search and rescue operations.
Right.
I guess they could also hang a dog from it, the cadaver dogs, but anyway. Gathering information for or supplying essentials for disaster management. Okay, I thought about that too. The Fukushima Daiichi plant, they could send drones down through the exploded roofs of the reactor buildings there and check out things and see what it looks like without having to put people at risk or having to go out there and set up robots to do it.
Yeah, well, there's also been a lot of application recently using drones in disaster relief after hurricanes. It was in the news here about some of that work that was being done in Houston, and one article I read reported in Rockport, Texas, further down closer to Corpus Christi, that they used drones. In 2.5 hours, they were able to get imagery of condition of over 2,000 buildings, and they say it would have taken over 2.5 weeks to do that by human on site.
And that would be 2.5 weeks once the infrastructure was repaired enough for them to be able to get there.
Right.
I mean, they need gas, they need roads, they need gasoline, they need power and everything else to be able just to get out there, and then it would take 2.5 weeks or so. So yeah, that I guess that's a big help. And
it's a lot safer too than having people get on ladders to go up on roofs and check them out and things like that.
Good point. Good point. And I guess the speed also in assessing the damage would enable them to handle the financial things sooner or make plans and whatnot, which would also help.
Yeah, one place I was reading, they would stream the drone image straight on into the claims adjusters so they could review it much more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought. We're talking about drones and different things they can do, what they are, problems they cause. Feel free to call in and share your thoughts or questions or challenges. 343-9927, 343-9927. And Lang, you were talking before the show about some other really interesting uses they've done.
Well, there's all kinds of applications that are on the market. I just mentioned, though, one thing I came across is the production of these drones is the market's pretty much been cornered by a Chinese company that now controls 70% of the production of these commercial drones.
Wait a minute. The Chinese? They're communist.
They're on the forefront of developing this technology, the hardware part of it, and a lot of the applications then is done by various separate operations companies that are focusing in on the particular industry that they're developing the software for. It's kind of like the way Apple computer was back before the Macs, back in the early 80s. Apple was an open architecture, and they just made this hardware, and there were dozens, hundreds of independent board developers where you plug your board in for the different kinds of uses you'd make of that hardware, which is kind of like the way later it flipped over and the IBM PC became the one where you can stick your individual boards in. Well, similar to that, this Chinese company is the big manufacturer of the hardware, but then there's all kinds of upstart companies developing the software for these various sectors of the economy, for the commercial application of it, like for the agricultural, for the industrial inspection, for construction is another area. They use the drones to, perhaps on a daily basis, go over and evaluate, take images from a construction site, and then they can feed that into the digital blueprint, so to speak, the original design, and compare against it and catch any discrepancies on a daily basis, instead of waiting to somewhere further down the line when you find out you've done something wrong, and then you have to go the big expense to go backtrack and fix that.
Yeah, okay. They could also see when workers are goofing off or taking extra long lunches and stuff like that.
They didn't mention anything about workers,
okay.
and the drones may be working, evaluating the site after the workers are gone. I don't know, but construction was listed in one report here as the most making the most use of this. They say they expect that over the next 5-year period, that construction would be spending over $11 billion in drone work. And agriculture is in second place with almost $6 billion. And then you get down to the insurance that we talked about earlier, and then after that, the infrastructure inspection that we also talked about. But and some of the really strange uses that are under development are developing insect-sized drones with little sticky appendages on them to pollinate and to make up for the loss of bee population. They'll use little drones to fly around and pollinate our plants for us. There's some folks in Japan working on that one. Who knows how long that'll be before it's tested, but that's one approach, one application that's being developed.
It just has me wondering if maybe we should all just go to these virtual reality things we can put on our heads and just create wonderful realities for ourselves. Yep. Instead of going to all this trouble to create drones to keep us alive, just make us happy till we all starve,
Yeah, plug us into the Matrix. Huh?
Yeah. Well, as long as you're happy, what the heck, right?
Well, on another direction that might not be as comforting, or maybe would be, depending on what's actually happening on the streets, is police are using them for crowd monitoring. And there are countries in southern Africa that are using drones to detect and deter poachers on game preserves. In Australia, they're using drones to look for sharks off their beaches so they can report shark alerts.
Yeah, that kind of bummed me out if I was swimming in the surf somewhere and a drone started flying around me.
Rather a drone than a shark.
Well, good point, but the drone might indicate that there's a shark somewhere nearby, or it thinks I'm a shark, but I get harpooned or something out there. You mentioned something about an Economist article that had a lot of neat stuff, or am I jumping ahead for you?
This is some of the stuff that was in that article, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so some other uses for the insect-sized drones are to survey inside of buildings. And indoor drones are also proposed for taking inventory of merchandise inside of warehouses. Where you're there, you don't have any FAA regulation issues because it's all inside your own premises. So they were pointing out that there's a lot of application of drones that are going to eliminate a lot of jobs.
I wonder if they have explosives sniffing devices that could be flown on drones and maybe help detect terrorism, terrorists and all that are going to their target or whatever. They've already got a very extensive monitoring and tracking system for explosives anyway, but still that might be one idea there.
Yeah, well, imagine if they can create a device that can detect it, and they'll be able to put it on a drone.
Yeah.
It's a lot of what enabled the development of these drones, or the miniaturization that happened with the development of smartphones. In fact, in this article, they say that the commercial drones didn't develop out of the military. They developed out of uniting the radio-controlled aircraft hobbyists with the miniaturization technology of the smartphone, with things like GPS location from the smartphone and motion detectors in the smartphones. All these micro electromechanical systems.
Okay. But what I read somewhere in here, the military spending, at least in the U.S., is the biggest driver of it. But the actual technological development is private individuals and companies and hobbyists and stuff, right?
Yeah, from what I read, if you look at the money that's being spent, it's 90% military expenditures on drones, but the devices themselves used in the commercial world weren't developed out of the military's production. They're developed from this other side.
Okay, well,
that Chinese company is the dominant producer of.
Yeah, I just still can't get over how a communist country could beat and dominate an industry, and not this free market country of ours. That sounds like heresy. But anyway.
Another area of application for high-altitude drones, and a couple are working on that. One, Facebook is working on high-altitude drones for internet access, with drones up like 60,000 feet or something that can distribute. I mean, this isn't in effect yet, but that's what they're doing research to try to develop a high-altitude drone for that.
What would give that the advantage over a satellite, though?
Well, I guess it would be cheaper.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Because another high-altitude application is to generate electricity by the wind from drones that are tethered to the ground. And so they're in the fixed location up there, connected by this tether, and the wind speeds are so much higher, they can, for a much lower cost, produce a lot more electricity than ground-based wind turbines.
Wow. That would be a heck of a drone, though, to carry something like that, like a generator. I don't know how they would, Hey, who knows? We got a few minutes left. I wanted to talk about some anti-unmanned vehicle defense systems that, I mentioned how we let off the show with Mr. Meredith, who blasted one of his neighbor's drones out of the sky in his neighborhood with a shotgun. And that was frowned upon by local law enforcement. But there's an article here from New Atlas. It says anti-UAV defense system uses radio beam to disable drones. And this apparently is in Britain, since they give the prices or the cost in pounds. But it's a company called Blighter. Blighter Surveillance Systems, it's called. And it uses radio beams, it says here, to freeze drones in midair by interfering with their control channels. And it says that it can disrupt the drone's operation by sending out a radio beam. Once they home in on it, they can send a 4-watt directional beam at the craft, which is on the receiving end, it's way more powerful than the control signal, and it could freeze the drone there and either fool the radio operator into thinking that it's malfunctioning, or just freeze it in midair and let it sit there until its batteries run out, and then it drops to the ground. And, I'm remembering how Iran stole one of our, they didn't really steal it, it was in their airspace, but they commandeered the control system of one of America's spy drones and landed it in their country, and they laughed at us.
Yeah, well, according to the Economist article, in some parts of the world, police have trained birds of prey to attack small drones, so it's a low-tech approach.
Yeah, well, hopefully it doesn't hurt the birds, but... that reminds me of a story I read years ago. There's a woman out west that was paragliding, and she was, off of the side of some mountain or whatever. She was paragliding over this valley, and a condor attacked her. Apparently, she had invaded its territory or whatever. But it just described her struggles to get down to the ground before it tore her whole chute apart, because it was tearing it apart. It was attacking the chute, and they said those birds have a wingspan of 9 feet. That's a big bird.
Right.
But anyway, yeah. So yeah, they'd be good at going after drones, I suppose. It's kind of like the Russian anti-tank dogs during World War II. Did I ever tell you about those?
No.
The Russians would train their dogs to eat underneath farm tractors with their engines running. And so the dogs learned that there was food underneath any great big machine that was making noise. And so when the tanks were coming across the steppes toward Moscow or St. Petersburg or whatever, they would strap satchel charges to the dogs with a trip stick sticking up on them, and they'd run out there into the field and dive under the tank and blow them up.
Wow.
So that's kind of a drone, right? Maybe
Canine suicide bomber.
Yeah, right. Well, Chris, they weren't doing it on purpose. They probably didn't shout Allahu Akbar, whatever. Anyway. No offense. Anyhow, you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We got to go. We thank you for listening. You have a good evening.